So, welcome to Sunday's virtual domain-driven design discussion about user story mapping and event storming. I'm Marco Heimeshoff, and I'm joined by our community friends Kenny Baas-Schwegeler and Zsófia Herendi. And yeah, we just did this for the first time now. Kenny and I were talking at a conference about how to model domain in depth, and Kenny was doing some example mapping in combination with event storming. And then we talked about an experiment he did 1.5 years ago or 2 years ago about user story mapping with event storming. And I'm very curious how that went and how did you come to do it? So what was your motivation to start with that, and what did you gain from that?
Yeah, so if we go back a bit, I used event storming. I learned it from Matthias, I think 6-7 years ago. And I started experimenting with it. And at some point, I came in a company who already did user story mapping like 3 years ago. And this was actually before I used event storming on a big picture scale. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I started experimenting with that. And at some point, I learned the big picture one. And it kind of dropped a bit for me, user story mapping. And then I think around 2 years ago, or 1.5 years ago, I thought, this is a good case. It's really good bounded. It's a product. So let's try to use user story mapping here because that's what they were already doing. So at that point, I started seeing the both perspectives and see how they can fill in each other.
Cool. So from my experience, when you do event storming, what you get is an in-depth view of the processes of a company, right? Of the whole business flow, of the whole business process. And it's good to actually understand what's actually happening in the business, not even focusing on software alone, but to really understand the whole business process and modeling where software can actually help. And if you go into detail level event storming, you obviously get something that helps with implementing. If you have CQRS and event sourcing architecture, you get some good hints of building aggregates and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. But what does user story mapping add to the whole process, or how is it different? What do you gain from user story mapping concrete when you do it in your domain?
Yeah, so I've discussed this with Alberto too, and of course he also got some inspiration. He told me from user story mapping, and the great part is that user story mapping is already bounded in a way, because you do it for a product usually. So we have a product where we use it. We used it for we call it here in the Netherlands a my environment, an environment where you can log in for your electric bill or for your phone bill. Then you log in and you have your own environment where you can do stuff. So we used user story mapping on that environment. What are the functions people need to do? And it's for that, for some reason in that specific context, it worked a lot better to talk about what are the tasks people need to do. While in event storming, you're more focused, of course, on events than tasks, which I find is better. But for some reason, it's harder for people to think in events than in tasks. So if people get a lot of pushback on event storming and trying to do that, user story mapping is more well known in for me in some product owner environment communities. So it's easier to start with user story mapping, especially for some product owners who get a lot more overview on their tasks and their user stories. So that's what they get out of the box in the Scrum process. While lately, I'm not sure if Scrum fits everywhere for me.
Yeah. So Zsófia, you work as a product owner, right?
A product manager already, but yeah, so more than 10 years I have been working on the product side, and that's why I knew user story mapping as a powerful tool. And I also learned about event storming last year in more details at Alberto's masterclass. And also I'm using event storming as well. And I haven't used these two techniques like combined with each other so far, but I'm planning to use that on my meetups and also at the company I'm working at. But yeah, so both are very powerful separately as well. So altogether, applying all together, it can be very, very good tool to, just discover the flow, the user journey, and then building the releases and building the features on the top of it. So like I would basically start with EventStorming though. So like discovering the whole user journey, and from there confidently you could do like you could mark the necessity of the flow steps or the workflow steps, and there you can go from there, because if you see that something is very necessary in your product, that could be your walking skeleton later on, and you can see the other things which are not that necessary maybe, and those can be the later releases on the top of the event storming wall. So I would start with the event storming first, but I haven't done that in practice, but I'm really planning to do.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So I always start with event storming because I've never done user story mapping. And for me, focusing on events is a big benefit that you do not think about what are users actually doing, because that's just one source of events, right? You're thinking about what could happen in our domain, even either by the choice or by the intention of users, but also by time that passes and other reasons, other systems that interact, physical world events that happen, stuff like that. So for those who don't know how event storming works and user story mapping, maybe we just flesh it out like in a few sentences to give a rough idea. So in event storming, you have a group of people in a room. You have business people and technical people, and everybody is brainstorming together at an empty wall with orange sticky notes where they write down events that can happen in your domain, like business events, shopping cart ordered, invoice sent, invoice paid, and stuff like that, in a time flow from left to right. And then after a while, once the model grows and grows, and you're confident that you filled all the gaps as much as possible in a short time frame, you're looking for the source of events. So why did this happen? Did it happen because a user had an intention and sent a command into our system? Or did it happen because time passed and the end of the month had just happened and now we have to react as a policy in our system? So all those things come from event storming. And I like it because it gives you, if you do it on a big picture scale, like on a really rough outline, you get a big understanding of a synchronized understanding of the whole business process. And if you go down to the details, you can really mark every decision that is made. If this user wants to do something, depending on the state of our business, how do we react to that? How do we respond to the user? You can get all those things in line in event storming. But you can also model processes are not user-centric. So if something just happens in the back end, whenever time happens, there are certain things that need to be done in your business. You even model them with your business experts without focusing on user at all. So since I've never done user story mapping, how does user story mapping actually look like? I mean, what are the details? How do you start? What's the approach there?
Yeah, so you start actually from a user's perspective more. So that's it's not entirely literally. You can do it with event storming too, of course. But I like the more user approach of it, which in a lot of companies they generally like to talk more about business processes, right? And in my perception, it's different. So a user journey is different from the business journey. So how do you start? Is you start generally the same, but instead of asking, so you can do it on two ways. First, you can let the person or a UXer or the user explain what they need to do, and everyone in the group writes down what they hear into tasks. Or you can do it the same as event storming does it. I'm not sure if that's actually in the book. You can all together write down the tasks that needs to be done for this certain product, right? And then you try to also fit it into a timeline. So you start from left to right in the timeline. You put on all the tasks that are being done, and you try to group them in certain user activities. And that's in the sense of what the user explains is a user activity, right? That's really dependent on the situation and the context. So it's more tasks based, and it's more based on what is the user actually doing and what's the need of the user in for this product.
Yeah. So Kathy Hirth is asking online right now, since she knows all event storming already, how do you come up with a good user story map without doing an event storming first? So from what I understand, what you've said is you focus around tasks and come up with all the things that need to be done to fulfill those tasks. But for that, you already need to have a pre-understanding of your domain, don't you? I mean, isn't that
well, it can either be a domain expert explaining and you writing, there's this heuristic also, which we use in event storming, or that can be used in event storming, that you say, well, let's not all start writing it down, but just let the domain expert explain, and the rest will write it down and put it on. I actually got this heuristic from forgot the name, but it's a nice heuristic to just let someone discuss who knows what they want and write the tasks down. If you do it yourself, you have the bias that you're filling it in for someone else.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So how do you make sure that you do not forget half of the story? Like when you have a centered approach around user actions, or if you have like one person who is filling out the forms, how do you make sure you don't forget most of the ideas? I mean, event storming puts the brainstorming activity first, where everybody can post at the same time, sticky notes to the wall.
You do the same here, actually. So
Okay.
it was actually from Christina Hurt. I got this for event storming, right? You let the domain expert talk, not write, and you write, and the rest of the group writes down and put the events on the wall or on the ground, as you can do user story mapping, or you can do it yourself. But I like the first part in user story mapping first, where the user or user expert will explain what needs to be done, and the rest will write down the task that they hear that are being performed. So then everyone together that don't have domain expertise will write it down on the board, and well, you can never be 100% sure, but probably you have everything.
So it's
sorry. The funny thing here is that I try to remember how we did user story mapping even before event storming or whatever, so back in time. And the funny thing is it's very, very similar like event storming. So we did this post-it thing when everyone on their own, just writing down what happens in the user journey. And we tried to come up together later on then with a user journey and then go from there. And it's very similar if I'm thinking about that. So like we were doing, I mean, almost the same. Yeah, we didn't call it that way because we didn't capture events. We just tried to capture workflow steps, let's say. But it's a very powerful thing to start with that.
Cool. So would you say there are different domains that benefit more from user story mapping than from event storming, and the other way around as well?
Interesting question. Never thought about it. So I think user story mapping also it's more from a user perspective. So when it goes more on business process, I would prefer event storming. So I've worked for asset management companies where you don't really have user interaction, but more like process interaction, where someone makes a trade and then it needs to pass all these certain policies, or and you can do user story mapping, but I have never tried it. So I would be rather curious what will happen when you use that.
Or you can do your event storming first, and then you can see whether you need, for instance, adding a user story map on the top of it because you want to maybe define your releases, or you want to see which features or which steps, which events are more necessary than the others. So you can even decide it on the fly, maybe.
Yeah, it's even nice. Maybe you can both do it. So the guiding heuristic we use, if the group is too big, well, maybe one group does a user story map and the other group does an event storm, and then you try to merge them.
Yeah, I like that. I've had big groups, and what I usually do is I split them into two groups, let them both storm, and then compare the models and switch people between groups later. That enriches the model already, but having just a different methodology, it would be really great.
Yeah. And you can also use them on top of each other, right? So you can have a group that's more interesting or focuses on the user kind of experience, and one group focusing more on the business perspectives. And then you can place them on top of each other and see where they relate. So at some point, the user journey needs to go into the business process. So that's another way of doing it.
Yeah. So I've had a client in marketplacing, B2B marketplacing, and they had very complex subdomains. So we were modeling bounded context, and we did an event storming to understand the whole domain. And it like usually with event storming and complex domains, it filled more than a room. And then after we derived the bounded context map from the event storm, there was kind of the problem of a product owner in the room who said, yeah, that's all nice and great and stuff, but the users who are actually using the system, they have a completely different user journey than your bounded context map that you came up with. So I was like totally puzzled, like how could we not see that when we were modeling all together? And that's when I realized, okay, maybe a user journey mapping would be the thing we're missing here. And maybe the user journey, or the user journey itself is its own bounded context that has just a lot of translation with the other contexts.
There's also this heuristic from Nick Tune aligned with domain experts. So if you're a domain expert, so you have some UXers who's only focused on the user, and then you have some other domain expert that's really focused on the business part. And maybe that's your bounded context right there, or your emergent bounded context, right? So you just split them up in that way.
Yeah. So I think there would be a lot of trade-offs if you put your user journey as your own bounded context. The translation can be horribly complex, I think. But on the other hand, if you don't do that, if you only focus your business, your development teams on the bounded context you discovered, then no one is really taking ownership of the user journey. So I think that's one of those big it depends moments where you have to look at your team and realize, does it fit if we do this or that? But you need to focus on both. User journey is so important, and I really want to experiment if user story mapping focuses you more on the user journey. So we have Yasser Erlekin asking online, if you start from user story mapping, not from event storming, if your model is not too static in the end, if you're not missing the journey to discover. So is user story mapping just taking single tasks that you want to do and mapping them out, how they relate to each other? Or do you actually follow a flow through different stories to get to a whole journey of your usage of a product?
Yeah. Well, not sure if I get the question correct. For me, I think user story mapping is not enough for domain discovery, that you can really go to implementation mode, because that's a difference between tasks and events. Tasks are intention. So within the tasks, I'm not really sure if what comes out of that task, because it's an intention. So it might fail, it might succeed. There might be business rules there. So there is a lot more to discover from that tasks of a user story mapping. But I think as a starter, you can from a user story map, you can create the boundaries or see what's more important, and from there go into event storming again on process level. Okay, we want this tasks, so that's the start, right? Let's say someone wants to change their email. Okay, that's the start. So what's the process then? So how do we discover that? So I think user story mapping is a good start point or a good in-between point to visualize your user stories. But it's definitely not the end. You still need more discovery afterwards. You still need more modeling afterwards, because it's all a task. So, it's good to find out the way a user thinks, but there's more to it.
The details also depends on how you do that. So you can do that in different detail levels, let's say. So you can start with a very high level, not workflow steps even, it's just boundaries or whatever. So like what you are going to maybe break down during the user journey analysis. So you can start on a very high level and then break it down into task level in your workflow, in the user workflow or user journey, and then go from there. It really depends, I think.
So you can, what you're saying is you can take a broader view on the task.
Sure. Because there was a part of the question, if I remember correctly, whether those are tasks in the user journey or whether those are steps in a workflow, or what are those in the user story maps. It can be both. It can be anything which visualizes the user journey in the system or in the domain. So it can be even first when you start it can be very high level, like feature groups even, or if it's not yet an existing software, it can be an idea, a domain part of it, and later on you can start to add tasks or workflow steps or more detailed steps on it.
How do you actually do that? Do you write down sticky notes that are just on a higher level, and then you write more detailed sticky notes and replace the broader one that you already have?
Yeah, but it really varies. So it depends on the audience as well, and the purpose, obviously, why you do the user story mapping, because you can do like ideation for a software that is not existing yet, but you want to figure out things. And also you can do that for existing domain as well, for like as-is scenarios, or discovering the existing domain or user journey, and then plan a release on the top of it. And you want to see what features are necessary in the next release, or these kind of things. So it really depends on purpose, for me at least, and also depending on the audience, so who are there. And
okay, so how would you merge the user story map once you have it and you have your EventStorm model? If you have both in paper form on the wall, how do you actually do the merging and the comparison?
I would do the merging, like let's assume you have a wall, an event storming wall. So you can see the domain flow there, you can tell the domain story, you have all the events there for that. And there, I would go for, let's say, necessity indication. So like I would ask the attendees to, on their own, to write down on Post-its or mark those events. I don't know, for instance, from 1 to 5, there is a necessity scale. And they should mark the events, how necessary are those in release 1, or what is the scope. So it really depends why you are doing the whole thing there. So they could mark the necessity of the different events, let's say, and then from there you can already break down, because user story mapping is also for defining releases. So like you can decide what to release as next and what to release later. And this happens by knowing the necessity of the different tasks or steps or whatever we call it in the user journey. And yeah, that's why I'm saying that. So you have an event storming wall, you just mark those necessities there and go from there. So grouping the same necessity levels.
Okay, I get that. So would you say that it's if you go into the detail level, so leaving the big broad design phase and going into implementation ready models, would you say that either model, event storming or user story mapping, help you to define your aggregates and your implementation model, or is any of both methods more better suited for doing that?
So yeah, for me, user story mapping is more like customer journeys. Maybe already founding that bounded context, because you really want to look in a user story map. There can still be several bounded contexts or even modules. So there still needs to be more of a design before we can talk about aggregates, in my opinion. We also haven't talked about, so where does consistency, where do you use aggregates? That's usually your business process.
Yeah.
We haven't talked about that in a user story map. That's why, going back to my previous statement, after a user story map, we still need to do refinements about the tasks. And to come back to what Zsófia said, user story map is really great to see what is important now. What do we need to build first? And over that, start doing event storming, or at the same time, of course, modeling your business processes already with business rules. So I usually start with event storming afterwards, or at the same time, starting with business rules first. And well, people who know me, I go to example mapping a bit, and then find out what are my boundaries. And inside the boundaries, then I start checking where are my business rules. Are they consistent? Are they eventual? And then I start talking about aggregates, because I had this discussion, well, not a discussion. I had someone saying, well, I talk about aggregates with my domain expert. I didn't really have a lot of success with that, because domain experts usually don't have a lot of time available to talk about that. And that's something I still need to explore a bit. So what I want to get out after a user story map in refinements are, what are my business rules?
Yeah.
What are my events? Because you don't talk about events. And that's how I would, well, not maybe merge it, but going from a big picture event storming to a product, diving into that product, discover more boundaries, and then go to event storming. For me, that's a natural fit.
Can I have a question on that?
Yeah,
sure.
So you mentioned as an outcome, you want to, like, from the user story map, you want to get out the events and the user journey. No, not. You mentioned that you want to get out the events from there.
not from there, but I want it eventually.
Okay, that's, yeah. I got it. So no.
Yeah, so so this is my experience doing event storming. When people do user story, customer journeys in event storming, you always get this two sides, right? You get a task that generates the same event in your flow, which for people sounds really strange. Why do I talk in events while I'm doing tasks in my customer journey?
So wouldn't it be the other way around, that if you discover events, that your events from an event storming are a seeding point to find the tasks in the user story mapping?
For me, that's what it worked. So that's what I wanted to say beforehand.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah, so I generally like to talk about events, but sometimes domain experts really need to switch their mind to tasks, from tasks to events, and they get all confused sometimes when I bring in event storming. Then I rather do user story mapping sometimes because it fits more with their way of thinking at that moment, and I don't need to get them out of it. And then for the business process, we can dive into event storming a bit more. So that's really contextual there.
Yeah, so I think that's a really valid point and a valuable point, depending on the group that you're modeling with. If it's a highly technically focused group, like if it's just developers and maybe one product owner who already learned to speak technology terms instead of domain terms to make them understand, if that's your scenario, user story mapping might be a way better fit, because I've had the problem before that you try to explain event storming to people and it takes sometimes even hours before they really realize they should not talk about technology at all. So user story mapping might be a good fit for that scenario, which is luckily getting rarer and rarer. But
And the downside now, what I see is event storming catching up, and people talk more about in event storming more on a domain modeling level, where they talk about aggregates and start talking about that we need this flow like blue, yellow, orange, then to purple, right? But if I want to discover, I don't want to get into that part yet. It's about discovery. So trying to get the technical out of the technical is a bit harder sometimes. I agree with that.
It's very easy for me not to talk about aggregates.
That's very fun. So
that's
Christina
good that you're here, right?
Just saying it here on the chat. She says her first rule on event storming session is there should be no tech words allowed, like aggregate or anything like that. And thumbs up for that. This is a very important rule. If you try to explore the business model and you talk about technology at all, the programmers will jump on technology because that feels safe, right? You feel safe working in the space that you know. And the domain for many people is just this ungraspable concept, this abstract thing, but technology, the database, the object, that's what I know every day. So getting people away from there is hard, but it's super necessary. So having some rules like it's not allowed to talk about objects, aggregates, or database at all, just talk about business terms, super important. But as I said, user journey mapping might be a valuable tool to get people there, making them think about the task that you're actually doing in the business terms.
Because the problem I sometimes see is that technical terms find their way into the domain terms. Because, and I've seen this a lot, where even managers start talking about databases and about technical terms, and then it's really hard to get them, and they're talking more about business side, right? So it's getting fluid and it's all over the place. And then switching to user story mapping, only thinking about the customer would be a nice option there.
You need to have a business person there who is starting to, ask annoying questions then when technology comes into play, like what is that? What is that? What is that? And they will be bored about that. And
but the problem there was that even the business side start talking technical. They were saying, okay, whenever we figure out the name of this thing, then that database table needs to be updated. And it took me 15 minutes to get him out of the mode that, no, it's not about the database. Everything you want is when you decide this, so name decided, then the rest of the company needs to start using it. And after 5 to 10 minutes, he finally says, yeah, that's what I want. That database update. And oh, there we go again. So
yeah, I mean, it's the same sickness as when people start talking about CRUD terms, you know, like we're creating a user, we're creating a customer, we're creating a product. I was like, no, you're not creating that product. It's already created. You're just creating an object, but that doesn't matter. What happens in your business terms? And in event storming, actually, this is what event storming is good for. It becomes very obvious. And as a facilitator, you can just walk around the wall, and whenever you see a CRUD term, you just tap the sticky note a little and have a discussion with the people who wrote it. And sometimes you even get surprised because they actually create a product because it's a product creation company. And then it's like, oh yeah, okay, good event. But need to make sure that they actually mean that in this moment.
Yeah. And that's fun to use a different, so like I use example mapping, but also use user story mapping. If you use another tool, people start thinking differently, and you can see how the language comes into play. If you compare your user story map with your event storming and the language is totally different, then we have either a good bounded context, but that usually is not the case. But you have a problem. Why are you calling it different here than here? And then you get into the language part. So that's really crucial.
Because language over technical terms in user story mapping. Means it's the same process just, or do you have different heuristics, different tricks there than in event storming?
So can you rephrase the question?
I can.
Do you use the same?
In event storming, I use a trick. As I said, when I walk around the wall and I see CRUD terms, this is my one heuristic. Whenever you read, create, update, delete, you just tap the sticky note and have a discussion with the person who wrote it and ask them if they really created a customer or if that didn't happen 30 years ago and they just now registered it in their domain. Discussion about the term. And the tapping of the sticky note is my visual hint, so I don't have to break up the flow. Everybody can keep modeling, but now we have a visual hint. We can go through that, and if this gets too much, I can just break the session and say, look, everybody just listen for a second. Here are 2-3 examples. Let's go through this in detail and realize why we're doing this, actually. So this is my trick in event storming when I try to focus on a ubiquitous language that is business-driven, not technical-driven. Do you have any tricks, heuristics, methods that you use in user story mapping to get to a better ubiquitous language?
I think generally I do the same. If I see ambiguity in the language, they start to use different words, different languages. If we go back, the powerful way I try to do it is everyone writes for themselves. I think that's the most powerful. Try to get their perspective on. So that means you try to get their language on the visual board. And then they need to enforce the timeline in event storming. Well, in user story mapping, you do the same. And then I tell them explicitly, every time you think you find a double event or task in this way, you have a discussion with the other person. You find that person. And I think that's my prime guiding heuristic for trying to focus on the language. So don't throw away that task or that event that you think is the same, because usually it's not the same. I've seen it 100 of times. But you just try to find that person and try to have a conversation about, is this really the same or not? And about your heuristic, I like that one. Never tried that one. Well, I do the red. Do you do it with the red stickies? You just place
the ubiquitous language, I just tap them. The red stickies are too sharp. I mean, I use them if I see contradictions in the domain. If there's something that's really wrong with the modeling, then I put a red sticky note to it because it's a visual anchor. Everybody will focus on the red sticky. But if it's just slight terminology, I mean, registering a customer, it's a different thing, and it's important to sharpen the language in the end, but it doesn't really, it's not valid the flow of modeling. So I just tap the sticky to have a visual reminder.
Okay.
I also like to start it like Kenny mentioned. Do you hear me, by the way?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, it just sounded strange. So I also like to start with like people getting the names and the task or workflow step names or whatever on their own first. And then when they are converging and they are discussing what the steps should be, they should make those clusters from those post-its they wrote down beforehand, and they need to agree on a name of that particular workflow step. And it means one name for one step. They agree together.
Yeah.
That should happen.
I don't know. Making them agree too early sometimes destroys diversity in the model. So I like them to agree in the end, so to converge to a model together. But in the beginning, I like them to have every little detail that's different mapped out, so that we can explore if there's an actual difference.
Yeah, it's just the workflow steps yet. So the user journey, discovering the user journey. So I haven't talked about the starting with event storming or whatever. I just like when you want to highlight the different workflow steps in the user journey. So what should be there? They should like agree on a name of those features or steps.
Yeah, I agree. So Kenny, you were talking about example mapping. How does example mapping differ from user story mapping? So from what I understand, user story mapping is about the tasks that you're trying to perform as a user in the system, and example mapping, just given the name, sounds like mapping out examples of what users want to do or what could happen.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between both methods?
Yeah, so it's a total different method for a total different problem at that point. Well, not totally different, but so the way Bruno Bocard told me, Matt Wayne came up with example mapping from the Cucumber people. And he says, whenever I go to a big corporate company, they fill in some user stories and then start implement it, right? But there's a lot of still confusion about it. So from a user story mapping perspective, you create user stories. Over that user story, you can create example mappings. And example mapping is like really simple. Give me a concrete example. So tell me the story about this user story.
Okay, so it's given when then scenario, for example. Like a given when then scenario.
Yeah, well, I don't like to talk about given when then at this stage yet, because it's also in the discovery. When you look at, that's really interesting. When you look at the BDD, because it comes from behavior-driven development, it's all about discovery phase. And the way they draw it is like, first you have a team that pulls up a user story, and then you go into the discovery phase. So you diverge. And at some point, you figure out, in example mapping, for instance, is a technique, but there's a lot of other techniques in Spec by Example book by Goiko. There's a lot of these discovering techniques. Then at some point, you figure out your examples that goes over that user story. Maybe you need to split a user story. Maybe the user story is perfect like that. You discover some rules. And at some point over then, when you just think you discovered enough, then you go to the formalize, and then you can formalize in given when then way, right? But only then. So people still have it in the back, but given when then is in the formalization stage. And after the formalization stage, you can, it doesn't need to be automate these given when thens with, for instance, Cucumber or SpecFlow and anything. And when you look at the way Eric Evans draw his whirlpool, it's actually the same. Because he first talks about give me concrete examples, then propose a model, and then try to prototype that model. So it's the same stages, right? So discovery, formalization. So formalization is a way in DDD is we create models, and then we prototype, we try it out, see if it works or not. So example mapping fits in that discovery phase, and I usually use it at some point with event storming, when I got my whole story complete, because then it's easier to talk about. Or in user story mapping, you can find a user story and use example mapping to go a bit deeper in the examples that needs to work on your system.
Cool, thanks.
So that's short thing how I use the three.
How do you technically do example mapping? Is it also sticky notes and you write the examples? Or?
No. So I used to do sticky notes, and then I was preparing this training with Bruno and Thomas, and then they said, no, we use this these cards, these index cards.
Yeah.
So when it's not really, so I reread the Cucumber blog, and it wasn't explicit for me, but what they use these cards, and they stand around a table in a sort of scrum, like a rugby scrum, right, together. And then they write it on the table where you can easily switch the cards around on the table. So you can split cards. And so that's a way. I sometimes also use it on a whiteboard with stickies.
Yeah.
So either way, I wrote a blog post about the pros and cons of these. But the original way is standing around the table, use these index cards.
Cool. So if you could send me that link, I can put it into the description of the YouTube video so other people can read it. That would be great.
Yeah.
Interesting. So standing around a table, for me, that sounds kind of weird because not everybody can see the cards in the same way, even if you can move them around, but we cannot read the same card at the same time when we stand in a circle. And what I really love about EventStorming is when you stand in front of a wall and you can freely move around and find your alliances, your people you want to work with, and everybody can see the model in detail or in the whole scope if you take a step back. That has such a great benefit. I would try to do the example mapping in a similar way. So find index cards that just stick on the wall. Do you see any benefits in doing it at a table, standing around it in a scrum fashion?
So the way Bruno told me is you're more on eye level with each other and you're close up. So given the context that this was discovered in, or not discovered, used in big corporates where there's usually hierarchy, right? Mm-hmm. Standing around a table close together, you can really look at each other and you feel a bit intimate. But there's a limit to that, and I think it's 4 to 5 people. The same way you do more detailed event storming, I like to stick with 5. 7 is okay, but especially for example mapping around the table, 7 can be a bit too much that people don't see, and but it's a different energy in the room. Definitely, I use them both now, depending on how the room is placed. Right, sometimes I use the table behind my event storm. But sometimes I like to move the table so there's no table. So then I just use the whiteboard. And for the whiteboard, I use this bigger stickies. So you have the bigger line stickies.
Yeah. So you put line stickies on the left side of the event storming model and then...
Yeah, on the left side of the event storming, I use the bigger stickies. Sometimes my approach is also different. I just start exploring with... so the way example mapping works on the blog post is you start with a rule. So a blue sticky or a blue card, you write down the rule and find examples. Then as the examples grow and the story grows, you find different rules. That's how example mapping works. Sometimes I do it the other way around and I say, okay, giving this event storm, give me as much examples possible that can happen here. So I start with small green stickies and just say, just write, you cannot write everything down, but just write a word that you know what this is about. And then I go into the example map, try to bring in the big green stickies and start visualizing it more. So those are a bit different approaches I use.
That's very interesting. I mean, I just started to think about that, like combining the user story mapping and the example mapping. You could have your examples and rules for against user stories. And for releases, when it comes to release planning or defining your releases, what will be in a release in the next most important one. So there, it can happen even that separate, so the different examples of a story could go into different releases even. So like maybe you can decide like you don't implement that particular example or scenario for that story, but you are going to handle the other one because in this release, for some reasons, it's very important.
Yeah, cool.
I just have it. I mean,
I even have what would be the best, but I usually go around corporates a lot, which they like to do the open spaces with these nice paintings on the walls, right? Not a lot of space. But I've been to a customer lately who says, well, I have a team in this room and it's all whiteboard. And you can use all the whiteboard to keep your user story map intact, to keep your event storming intact for a while. and just cross references all the time, right? So use your user story map for more of a planning. So pull stuff out of your user story map, do some event storming, do some example mapping, do some modeling. And this way, creating a whole room with the whole visualization, that's really powerful.
Real modeling space that keeps the visualization intact. That is neat.
Yeah, that I think companies really underestimate the power of having so much whiteboard space where you can just draw, stand up, go to the board, we have a discussion, make it visual, go.
Yeah. So most companies that I model with, they at some point they say, okay, this is good, this is great, now stop modeling and get to work again. And that is so toxic, because if you think like that, if the modeling is not your work, then you actually miss the point of modeling. I think modeling is the work you're doing. The typing of code is just an afterthought. You need to make it compile at some point, but the actual work is making the model work, and having an office that is just for modeling with only whiteboard walls, it's like a dream. I really want to have that.
Yeah, so the place where I work, or my consultancy place, they have it, but maybe it's even worse, because then I go to the companies and consultant and they don't have it, and then just want to go back and invite them to where I work and have like, oh, these are the walls, let's just, and you see you see the difference, like instantly, how much, if you have this amount of whiteboard space, you see instantly the difference in people willing to do these meetings. It's a totally different vibe.
Cool. Good. So are you experimenting right now with something new? Do you approach any modeling with event storming first, or user story mapping, or are you having anything else at the horizon that you're trying to get at as the next phase?
Yeah. So there's two things: domain storytelling for one. And my colleague and friend João, I'm probably not pronouncing his name correctly again, and he will laugh, but João is now starting with impact mapping first and then go to big picture. So I haven't talked a lot about that, but with him, so I want to more explore that.
Cool. Can we get João for another session in the future to have a discussion about impact mapping? That would be great.
Yeah, we can. Let's do it.
That's a great idea.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So I'm out of questions. Thank you very much. Do you have anything else that you want to ask, or is anyone in the chat still open for a question?
Just reacting for your previous question, like we planning something. On my next meetup, I really plan to combine event storming and user story mapping. So I'm very curious how it will work out. I definitely let you know if you are interested. So like it will happen sometimes end of June. I haven't announced it yet because I'm still planning how to do that. But yeah, so that's the plan. And cool. I'm planning to do that like on a very high level, big picture event storming, to the point where people are able to tell the domain story. And from there, as I mentioned before, so like having the necessity of the things indicated and then go from there. I mean, grouping the releases and stuff like that. I haven't figured it out fully yet, but yeah, so I will let you know how it goes.
Yeah, that's the fun part, right? Discovering.
Obviously. Yeah.
Enough
to learn. So then, thank you very much. We're going to put all the links down in the description, like the blog post Kenny mentioned, the books we talked about, and also the events that are happening. And if you want to see what happens in the future, go to virtualddd.com, join the meetups, and you'll be informed about our next, maybe João session about impact mapping.
Yeah. One note, we have an open email now, submissions@vdd.com, at virtualddd.com. We'll also post it, where you can submit your own session. Maybe you want to talk about anything, we can interview you, or we'll
become part
put that in the description. Become part of the community.
Wonderful. Have a good Sunday.
You too. Thanks for everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.